Hi, I'm Anna, and welcome back to the D1 Audible Cheat Sheets. This and the next episode will cover chapter 18, which is specific options for red wine making. When you make red wine, you're really making a series of decisions about extraction. You're deciding how much color you want, what kind of tannin you want, and how bold or transparent you want the wine to feel. And you're doing that by controlling four levers that show up again and again in this chapter: temperature, time on skin, how actively you move skins through juice, and the medium you're extracting into. Color comes primarily from anthocyanins. And in young red wines, whose anthocyanins on their own aren't specially stable, they become far more stable when they bind with tannins, which is why tannin management isn't just a texture question, it's also a color question. Oxygen matters here too, because gentle oxygen exposure helps anthocyanins and tannins join up into more stable color compounds. That's one reason why processes such as microoxygenation and barrel aging can improve color stability, even though over time every red will still drift from ruby towards brown. The key nuance is that those anthocyanin tannin compounds hold color longer than free anthocyanins. Even before fermentation begins, red grapes often still get chilled on arrival. They're less vulnerable to oxidation than whites because skins contain protective phenolics, but chilling still slows oxidation and spoilage organisms, and it also sets you up if you're planning cold soak. Most red wines are made by destemming and crushing, and once you've got that must, you can adjust acidity, sugar, even tannin if needed before you begin. Then comes the first major stylistic fork. Do you macerate before fermentation? And if so, do you do it cold or do you use heat? Cold soaking, also called pre fermentation maceration, is about extracting color and flavor without dragging too much tannin into the party. The logic is simple: anthocyanins dissolve best in the watery environment of must, while tannins dissolve most readily once alcohol is present. So, if you keep the must cold, typically around 4 to 10 degrees Celsius, you slow oxidation, slow spoilage, and you also avoid a spontaneous ferment taking off. 3 to 7 days is common, and during that time, you'll still mix the cap with punching down or pumping over because a neglected cap can become a microbiological problem. Cold soak is gentle and controllable, which is why it's so common for premium Pinot Noir. Pinot has relatively low anthocyanins, so this is one way to build color intensity without aggressively extracting tannin. But it costs money, both in refrigeration and in tank space, so it's rarely ideal for high volume, inexpensive reds. Then there's the opposite philosophy: maceration using heat, built for speed. Thermovinification heats must to around 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher, for minutes to hours, depending on the temperature. Flash detant is the high tech cousin. Grapes are quickly heated to about 85 to 90 degrees Celsius and then rapidly cooled under vacuum, sometimes in as little as 2 minutes. The point is to burst skin cells and dump anthocyanins and flavors into the juice very quickly. Done well, the short time at high temperature limits cooked flavors, but the equipment is expensive, so it's typically a high volume tool. There's a trade off though. If you press off skins early to keep tannins low and the style fruity, you can end up with color instability later because you've pulled plenty of anthocyanin but not enough tannin to stabilize it. That's why these techniques tend to suit inexpensive or mid priced wines meant for early drinking, or they're used as a blending component to bring juicy fruit into a larger wine. The other important practical advantage is that high heat can denature oxidative enzymes from botrytis, like lacase. And flash deterrent can also be used as a treatment for smoke taint. Critics will tell you the fruit can feel loud but less varietally precise, which is another way of saying it can be effective, but it can also flatten nuance. Once fermentation is underway, cap management becomes the heartbeat of red winemaking. Skins rise, buoyed by carbon dioxide, and form a cap. If you leave that cap alone, the small volume of liquid around the skins becomes saturated and extraction slows. Worse, a dry cap can become an ideal home for spoilage organisms and for acetic acid bacteria converting alcohol into acetic acid. Mixing also helps spread heat evenly, which matters because fermentation generates heat. And it also often introduces oxygen, which can support yeast health and reduce the risk of reductive sulfur compounds. So, cap management isn't just extraction, it's also about microbiological safety and fermentation control. Here's why style really gets built, because you're choosing not only the technique, but the intensity, frequency, and timing. More frequent or longer mixing extracts more, and timing matters. More mixing early tends to prioritize color, while mixing late when alcohol is higher tends to pull more tannin. A smart winemaker might even cool the ferment near the end to reduce tannin extraction if a softer style is the goal. Punching down or pigeage is the romantic one. A plunger submerges the cap by hand or machine. It's gentle, but manual punching down is labor intensive and realistically fits small open top fermenters, which is why it's linked to premium wines and smaller lots. Pumping over remontage is the workhorse. You take juice from the bottom and spray it over the cap. It's gentle because you're wetting rather than breaking the cap, so it's often paired with other techniques to reach the extraction level desired. It can be done aerobically, splashing against the vat wall, or more anaerobically in closed systems. It's widely used across grapes, price points, and vessel size, and modern wineries can program pump overs, lowering labor cost. Rack and return, delustage, is more extractive. You drain the tank, the cap collapses, then you pump the wine back over the skins, really breaking things up. Because it's powerful, it might only happen a few times during fermentation, alongside gentler moves. It's common for varieties and styles where medium to high color, tannin, and flavor are wanted, like Cabernet Sauvignon or Syrah. It's also less automated, requires spare clean vessels, and needs hands on setup and monitoring. Ganymede tanks are a clever engineering approach that use gas pressure, often CO2, to build beneath the cap until it bursts, breaking the cap effectively. Like rack and return, it's extractive and suited to medium to high extraction styles, but it can be automated, which is why it's becoming more common. Oxygen can even be used if the winemaker wants more aeration. The tanks cost more than standard stainless steel, but less labor can offset that. Rotary fermenters take extraction seriously. Horizontally closed tanks rotate and blades break up the cap, and the horizontal format increases skin to juice contact. They're efficient, programmable, and great for high volume production of wines that need medium to high extraction. But they're relatively expensive, and because they can be so extractive, they're less often the choice for very fine wines where precision and restraint matter more than sheer efficiency. Beyond cap management, there are a couple of extra tricks. Sanye is must concentration. You draw off some juice after crushing to concentrate what remains, boosting color, flavor, and tannin in the reds that stay behind. It reduces volume, so it pushes price pressure upward, but the removed juice is usually pale and can become rosé, which is why it's often a part of a broader winery strategy rather than a single isolated choice. Co fermentation is another stylistic lever, fermenting varieties together. The most famous form is a small proportion of white grapes, often up to around 5%, fermented with a red. The story here is that some phenolics from the white grapes may help bind with anthocyanins, increasing color intensity and stability. And the white grapes can also add aromatics like the floral lift of Viognier. Research shows mixed results, and too much white can dilute color, but the tradition is real, especially in Cote Roti with Syrah and Viognier, and the idea has been copied around the world. It doesn't inherently add cost, but it's more a choice of vision. Then we reach the other big stylistic fork. What if you don't crush at all? Whole berry and whole bunch fermentations are about creating an oxygen free environment inside intact grapes. So, intracellular fermentation begins. In that environment, grapes shift to anaerobic metabolism. Some sugar turns into alcohol without yeast involvement, and malic acid breaks down too, which can cut malic acid up to half, lowering total acidity and raising pH. Glycerol rises, giving a rounder texture, and a very recognizable aromatic signature can appear: kirsch, banana, bubblegum, cinnamon. The technique doesn't necessarily cost more by itself, but if it requires hand harvesting, sorting, and later oak, those choices will lift price. In full carbonic maceration, whole bunches go into a vessel filled with CO2. Intracellular fermentation runs until about 2% alcohol. Then the grapes are pressed and fermentation finishes off the skin. You get color but very little tannin because tannins extract best with alcohol, and you haven't had much alcohol in contact with skins before pressing. The result is fruity, low tannin, meant for early drinking, often without oak, and it can be a smart way to create pleasant wines even from high yields or less than perfect ripeness. Beaujolais Nouveau is the classic reference. Semi carbonic doesn't start with added CO2. You fill the vessel with whole bunches, the bottom bunches crush, yeast begin fermenting the released juice, and that fermentation generates CO2 that then blankets the remaining intact grapes. Depending on the desired style, you can press and finish off skins for something light and carbonic, or you can keep fermenting on skins with cap management to build more body and tannin, potentially followed by post fermentation maceration and oak aging. This is where carbonic derived aromas can integrate more seamlessly with varietal fruit, and it is used beyond Gamay, Pinot Noir, Malbec, Tempranillo, Carignan, and more when a softer fruit forward style is the goal. A third variation is to include whole bunches or bunches within a crushed fruit ferment from the start. They aren't blanketed in CO2 perfectly, but they're largely submerged and protected from oxygen enough that intracellular fermentation still happens. The percentage of whole fruit shapes how carbonic the final wine feels. Punching down progressively crushes the whole berries, and the result is generally described as smoother in texture with fresher, more vibrant primary aromatics. It's used widely and its effect is variable because producers apply it in many different ways. That's the start or the heart of red winemaking choices at the fermentation stage: extraction, timing, oxygen exposure, and how intact the fruit is when the process begins. In the next episode, we'll follow the wine after fermentation because the decisions don't stop when the sugars hit dry, they change form. I hope this helps with your prep, and I'll see you in the next episode.